The document hit the surface of Judge Horace Pembroke's oak desk with a sound like a gunshot, and every soul in that cramped Dodge City courthouse held their breath. Pearl Merriweather did not flinch. She stood with her spine perfectly straight, her dark eyes fixed on the man who had just laid what he claimed was the deed to the Merriweather ranch, her dead husband's land, the soil she had bled and wept and worked for 3 years, across the judge's desk as though he were setting down a royal flush. His name was Clarence Dodd, and he wore a silver brocade waistcoat and the kind of smile that had purchased its way through many a legal dispute in the Kansas territory. Behind him stood 2 hired men with their thumbs hooked in their gun belts, and beside him stood a woman tall, copper-haired, dressed in traveling clothes that still carried the dust of a long road, who had introduced herself as Mrs. Vivienne Holt, and who claimed to be the rightful heir to everything Pearl had built. "The deed is dated March of 1876, Clarence Dodd said smoothly, spreading his hands over the document as though blessing it. "Signed by one Harold Merriweather, transferring the property and all its holdings to Miss Vivienne Holt upon his death. Your husband, Mrs. Merriweather, made this arrangement before your marriage, before you entered the picture at all." Pearl's jaw was tight. She could feel the heat of 24 stairs pressing into the back of her neck. The courthouse gallery was packed, ranchers, townsfolk, a handful of railroad men who had very specific interests in how this dispute resolved. Everyone was watching to see if the widow Merriweather would crack. She did not crack. Standing against the far wall, arms folded and hat low over his gray eyes, Stephen Wells watched her with an expression that gave nothing away. He had ridden in from his own spread that morning, drawn by the same rumor that had drawn every curious soul in Ford County, that someone had arrived to take the Merriweather widow's land. He told himself he had come out of neighborly interest. He had told himself that every day for the past year, every time he found a reason to ride past her fence line, every time he brought extra timber when she needed repairs and called it nothing more than what a decent neighbor would do. He watched Pearl now, and he felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, something worse. The specific dread of watching something precious stand at the edge of a cliff. Judge Pembroke adjusted his spectacles and lifted the deed from his desk. He was a meticulous man, slow and deliberate in every motion, and he read the document in silence for a long moment. Then he set it down and looked over the rim of his glasses at Pearl. "Mrs. Merriweather, have you any response to this claim?" Pearl reached into the leather satchel at her side. Her hands were steady. That steadiness, Stephen noticed from across the room, was not the steadiness of a woman who was resigned. It was the steadiness of a woman who was absolutely, completely ready. "I have several," she said, "but I will start with this." She placed a document of her own on the desk, and then she looked directly at Clarence Dodd, and the smile she gave him was the kind of smile that cuts. "Your deed," she said, "is a forgery." The room erupted. Stephen Wells straightened from the wall before he had made any conscious decision to do so. He watched Dodd's face cycle through surprise, manufactured outrage, and something else, something sharper and more frightened that the man shut down very quickly. He watched Vivienne Holt grip the back of a chair, and he watched Pearl Merriweather stand in the center of all that noise like a woman who had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. This was not the beginning of the story. It was barely the middle of it. The beginning was a year ago, almost to the week, when Pearl Merriweather had buried her husband on a cold April morning, with the prairie wind cutting across the cemetery like a judgment, and she had turned from that grave alone, without a single living relative to stand beside her, and she had looked at the 2,000 acres of Kansas grassland that Harold had left behind, and she had made a decision. She was going to keep it. Harold Merriweather had been a decent man. Not a particularly demonstrative one, not a man given to sentiment or poetry, but decent in the way that counted on the frontier, reliable, honest, and hardworking. He had married Pearl when she was 22 and he was 34, not out of grand passion but out of mutual practicality, and a shared belief that the land could provide a good life if a person was willing to work hard enough to earn it. Pearl had understood the arrangement. She had come into it with clear eyes. And she had found, over the 4 years of their marriage, that while Harold might not have been the love of her life in any romantic sense, he had respected her mind and her capabilities in a way that very few men of 1876 Kansas were willing to do with their wives. He had taught her everything about running the ranch. Not because he was being kind, though he was, but because Pearl had simply demanded to know. She had followed him through every task, absorbed every technique, and within 2 years had developed methods for managing the herd and rotating the grazing pastures that Harold himself admitted were superior to anything he had done before. When he died of a fever that swept through the county in the spring of 1879, Pearl had been devastated not by loss of romance, but by the loss of a partner and the weight of being completely, suddenly alone. She was 26 years old, and she owned one of the most valuable stretches of ranch land in Ford County, and every man within 50 miles immediately assumed she would either sell it or find a new husband within the year. Pearl had done neither. She had hired 2 reliable ranch hands, a pair of brothers named Cobb and Eli Danner who were honest workers, and asked no unnecessary questions. She had established her own credit at the Dodge City Bank under terms she negotiated herself, standing at that counter with a calm so thorough that the banker, Mr. Aldous Finch, had eventually stopped trying to redirect her to a male representative and simply dealt with her directly. She had attended every town council meeting. She had introduced herself to every rancher whose land bordered hers. She had built and maintained and improved. And then, 14 months after Harold's death, on a Tuesday morning in June of 1880, Clarence Dodd had ridden onto her land with Vivienne Holt and 2 armed men and a piece of paper. Stephen Wells had been repairing a section of fence on his northeast boundary when Cobb Danner had come riding hard across the open grass to tell him. Stephen owned the land that shared Pearl's southern border, 700 acres of good cattle country that he had built up over the past 5 years from almost nothing, arriving in Kansas at the age of 28 with a background in Texas cattle driving and a very specific intention to stop moving and start building. He was 33 now. He was the kind of man who was called steady, which was a word that sometimes felt to him like a polite way of saying he kept his feelings well below the visible surface. He had told Cobb Danner to go back and tell Mrs. Merriweather he would be in town by morning. He had ridden into Dodge City in the blue dark before dawn, and he had walked into that courthouse when the doors opened, and he had taken his position against the far wall, and he had watched. He had watched Pearl walk in carrying that leather satchel like she was walking into battle with the exact weapon needed to win it. He had watched Dodd lay down his forgery with theatrical satisfaction. He had watched the judge pick it up. And then he had watched Pearl reach into that satchel and say the 3 words that changed everything. The room was still loud with competing voices when Judge Pembroke raised one large hand and brought the gallery to silence with the authority of a man who had been doing this for 20 years and had very little patience left for theatrical displays. "Order," he said. "Mrs. Merriweather, you have made a serious accusation. I will give you the floor to make your case." Pearl smoothed the front of her dark riding skirt with one hand, a gesture so unconscious and so composed that Stephen found himself watching it with something he could not immediately name. And then she opened the leather satchel and began to lay documents on the desk with the methodical precision of a woman dealing cards in a game she knew she would win. "I am a document analyst," she said, and the gallery went very quiet. "Before I married Harold Merriweather and came west, I studied under a professor of forensic document examination at the University of Ohio. I spent 3 years learning the science of identifying fraudulent documents, forged signatures, fabricated dates, falsified seals. It is not a common specialty. It is, however, a precise one, and I have spent the last 3 days applying every technique I know to the deed that Mr. Dodd presented to this court." She laid 4 sheets of paper in a neat line before the judge. "The first observation is the ink composition. The deed presented by Mr. Dodd claims to have been signed in March of 1876. However, the iron gall ink used in the signature section has an oxidation pattern consistent with a document no older than 8 months. Iron gall ink darkens and corrodes paper fibers at a predictable rate depending on age and storage conditions. The signature on this deed was written no earlier than October of 1879, 6 months after Harold Merriweather was already dead." A murmur rolled through the gallery. Dodd made a sound, and his lawyer put a hand on his arm. "Second," Pearl continued, "the notary seal. The deed carries a seal from a Denver notary named Mr. Arthur Crane. I have here a letter from the Denver County Clerk's office, received by telegraph relay yesterday evening, confirming that Arthur Crane retired from notarial practice in January of 1876, 2 months before the alleged date on this deed. He could not have notarized a document in March of that year." She laid the telegraph letter beside the other papers. "Third, the signature itself. I have here 4 authenticated samples of Harold Merriweather's handwriting, including 2 documents notarized in this very courthouse and 2 personal letters witnessed by our neighbor, Mr. Thomas Hatch. I have performed a comparative analysis of letter form ratios, pen pressure variation, and baseline consistency. The signature on Mr. Dodd's deed does not match. The letter proportions in Harold's authentic signature show a consistent relationship between the capital H and the lowercase letters that follows. In the forged signature, this ratio is reversed, which is a common error made by someone copying a signature they have studied but never embodied." The gallery was silent in a way it had not been since the proceedings began. Stephen Wells had not moved from the wall. He was not sure he had breathed. Pearl picked up a small magnifying lens from her satchel, the kind used by jewelers and document examiners, and held it up. "I have physical examples available for the court's examination. I would also note that I have prepared a written summary of my findings, signed and certified by my own qualifications, and I am prepared to defend every conclusion under questioning." She folded her hands in front of her and looked at Judge Pembroke with an expression of absolute calm. "The deed is a forgery, Your Honor, and I can prove it." Stephen Wells felt the shock move through him like cold water. He had known Pearl Merriweather was capable. He had seen her manage a herd rotation strategy that doubled the Merriweather cattle's weight gain before market. He had watched her negotiate with the railroad land agents and walk away with terms that left men with twice her experience shaking their heads in admiration. He had known she was intelligent. He had not known this. He had not known about the ink and the ratios and the microscopic precision of what she had just done, and he stood against that courthouse wall with his arms still folded and his face still controlled, and felt something deep and fundamental rearrange itself inside him. He had thought, perhaps, that he would need to step in. He had ridden to Dodge City with some half-formed idea of being useful, of lending his name or his physical presence or his established standing in the county to help in whatever way she needed. It was a thought he now understood to be both sincere and slightly condescending, and the sharp recognition of that condescension embarrassed him in a way he was glad no one could see. She had not needed him to step in. She had brought a scalpel to a gunfight and performed surgery. Clarence Dodd's attorney was attempting to raise objections, but they had the desperate quality of a man clutching at loose rope. Judge Pembroke was reading Pearl's written analysis with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly how thorough it was. Vivienne Holt had gone pale beneath her copper hair and was speaking in low, urgent whispers to one of the hired men beside her. Stephen pushed off from the wall. He walked quietly to the front of the gallery and found a seat in the second row, close enough to see Pearl's face when she turned briefly to survey the room. She did not look at him. She was focused entirely on the judge. But he saw the moment, the small, almost invisible exhale she allowed herself, the brief closing of her eyes that lasted perhaps half a second, and he understood that she was not as unaffected as she appeared. She had been carrying this for 3 days. 3 days of ink analysis and handwriting comparison and telegraph messages, and the specific terror of knowing that everything she had built was at risk, and that she was the only one equipped to defend it. He felt something in his chest that was not comfortable and not new, because if he was honest, and Stephen Wells was, above most things, honest, it had been there for the better part of a year. Judge Pembroke set down the written analysis. He looked at Clarence Dodd over the top of his spectacles with an expression that communicated an opinion formed and firmly held. "Mr. Dodd," the judge said, "I am going to refer this deed and Mrs. Merriweather's analysis to the Ford County District Attorney for a full investigation. In the meantime, I am issuing a temporary injunction preventing any transfer or claim upon the Merriweather property until this matter is fully resolved through proper legal channels. I would also strongly advise you to retain competent legal counsel." He paused. "More competent than what you currently have." The gallery exhaled as one. Pearl stood very still, and Stephen watched something move across her face: relief, exhaustion, something complicated that she gathered back under control within moments. Dodd was already in low, heated conversation with his lawyer. Vivienne Holt was looking at Pearl with an expression that Stephen thought was harder to read than simple anger. There was something that looked almost like reluctant admiration there, quickly suppressed. As the court dissolved into noise and motion, Stephen moved through the crowd toward Pearl. She was sliding her documents back into the leather satchel, and when he reached her side she glanced up at him with those dark eyes that always looked like they were measuring something. "Stephen," she said simply. "Pearl." He looked at the satchel. That was extraordinary. She gave him a look that acknowledged the compliment without entirely accepting it. It was necessary. "You've been working on that analysis for 3 days. 2.5. She snapped the satchel closed. "I didn't sleep much." He looked at her face, then really looked, in the direct way he usually kept himself from doing, and saw the shadows under her eyes and the tight set of her jaw and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from sustained, concentrated mental effort under extreme emotional pressure. She was 27 years old, and she had buried her husband and built a ranch and faced down a conspiracy to steal her land, and done it all with a quiet, furious competence that made something ache in his chest. "Can I buy you a meal?" he said. "You should eat something." Pearl considered him for a moment. The courthouse was emptying around them, and in the sudden relative quiet he was very aware of how close they were standing, of the leather and prairie grass smell of her, of the way she tilted her chin up slightly when she was deciding something. "Yes," she said. "All right." They walked out of the courthouse and into the Dodge City afternoon. The main street was its usual organized chaos. Cattle drives had started for the season, and the town hummed with the particular energy of commerce and movement. They walked side by side to the Drover's Rest, a restaurant that occupied the ground floor of the main hotel and served food that was not remarkable but was consistent and plentiful. The waitress brought them coffee without being asked, which was the correct instinct, and they sat across from each other at a corner table while Pearl set the leather satchel on the floor beside her chair and allowed herself slowly to come down from the pitched height of the morning. "How did you know?" Stephen said. "About the forgery, I mean. What made you look?" Pearl wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "The date," she said. "The moment Dodd mentioned March of 1876, something felt wrong. Harold never mentioned Vivienne Holt to me, not once in 4 years. He was not a secretive man. He talked about his past, his family in Missouri, his first years in Kansas, his failed attempt at a Missouri cattle operation before he came west. He never mentioned her." She paused. "And then I thought about the timing. Harold's death was recorded in the county registry, and that registry is public information in Dodge City. Anyone who wanted to know about his estate could have accessed it. If you wanted to fabricate a prior claim to that estate, 1876 would be a logical date to choose, early enough to predate our marriage, recent enough that the paper and ink would not obviously be degraded. Whoever forged that deed thought about the date carefully, but they did not know about ink oxidation rates. Stephen watched her. Where did you learn about those? Professor Eli Hartwell, University of Ohio, 1870 through 1873. He was a remarkable teacher. A small smile crossed her face. He used to say that paper remembers everything. People forget that paper remembers. And Dodd, do you know who he is? Why he came after your land specifically? Pearl's expression shifted, and Stephen recognized the shift. This was the thing she had not said in court, the thread that connected to something larger. I have a theory, she said. Tell me what you know about the new rail line proposal. Stephen set down his coffee. The Missouri Pacific Extension. They want to run a spur line through southern Ford County to connect to the Abilene route. Through my land, Pearl said simply. The most direct route for that line goes directly through the southeast corner of the Merriweather property. I have had 2 separate inquiries from railroad representatives in the past 4 months. I declined to sell the right-of-way at the prices they offered. She looked at him steadily. I suspect Vivienne Holt is connected to the railroad's land acquisition efforts in some capacity. I suspect Clarence Dodd was hired to remove me from the picture entirely. Once the title transferred to a compliant owner, the railroad would have its right-of-way and everyone in the arrangement would be paid. Stephen absorbed this. That's a significant accusation. Yes, she agreed. Which is why I did not make it in court today. I have the forgery. I do not yet have proof of the railroad connection. I intend to get it. He looked at her across the table, at the deliberate, strategic mind working behind those calm dark eyes, and he felt the same reorganization he had felt in the courthouse settle into something more permanent. You intend to investigate the railroad. I intend to resolve this completely, she said. The injunction protects me temporarily, but Dodd could appeal. The district attorney could be slow. I need the full picture. The food arrived, and they ate for a while in the comfortable silence that had always characterized their friendship, because they were friends, had been friends for the better part of a year, though neither of them had ever used a word with more weight than that. Pearl ate methodically and purposefully, the way she did most things, and Stephen found himself watching her hands more than was strictly appropriate and directing his attention back to his food with a regularity that would have embarrassed him if anyone were paying attention. After a while she said, "Why did you come today?" He considered the question honestly. "Cobb Danner rode out to tell me what was happening. I wanted to be here in case you needed anything. I had it managed." "I know that now," he said. "I didn't know the scope of it when I rode in." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "You thought I might need rescuing." It was not quite a question, and it was not unkind, but it was precise, the way she was always precise. "I thought you might benefit from a friendly face in the gallery," he said carefully. I was not wrong about that part. Something in her expression softened the smallest fraction. "No," she allowed. "You were not wrong about that part." They were quiet for another moment, and then Pearl said, "I would like your help with the investigation, not because I cannot do it myself, because the railroad men will speak differently to you than they speak to me, and because if this does go further than Dodd, if there are more parties involved, it would be useful to not be alone." Stephen looked at her steadily. "You have it," he said. "Whatever you need." She nodded, and it was the nod of someone who has made a decision and filed it away. And Stephen understood that the offer had been accepted not as charity and not as protection, but as a genuine partnership between 2 people who each brought something the other did not have. The recognition of that was a kind of joy he had not expected to feel in a Dodge City restaurant on a summer Tuesday. They spent 2 more hours going over what she knew. Pearl produced, from the apparently bottomless leather satchel, a set of notes she had compiled on the Missouri Pacific land acquisition process, names of agents, documented purchase offers, a hand-drawn map showing the proposed spur line route, and its relationship to every parcel of land in its path. She had acquired the map through a contact at the county surveyor's office, a woman named Mrs. Ida Forsyth, who had been providing Pearl with information about the railroad's activities for the past 2 months. "You've been building this case for a while," Stephen said. "I have been paying attention," she corrected. "There is a difference. Building a case implies I knew what I was looking at. For the first month I was simply gathering information because something felt wrong. The picture only resolved when Dodd arrived." He nodded slowly. He was looking at the map, at the clear diagonal line of the proposed spur that cut through the southeast corner of the Merriweather property, and he traced the line with one finger and noticed that it also ran along the very edge of his own southern boundary. Not through it, just along it. "The Holt woman," he said. "Vivienne Holt. You said you don't know her connection to the railroad." "Not yet. But she traveled from somewhere with Dodd, and that travel was organized and purposeful. She was not a random accomplice. She was chosen because of the name Holt is a common enough Kansas name, and a woman presenting herself as a possible prior heir would look more sympathetic than a railroad land agent. She was meant to be the face of the claim." Pearl paused. "I almost feel sorry for her. Almost. She walked into a courtroom and stood behind a forgery which makes her either a victim of Dodd's scheme or a willing participant." "Which do you think?" Pearl considered this seriously. "I think she was told the story would hold. I think she believed it because she wanted to believe it. There may have been money promised. I think she is frightened now." She paused again. "I am going to speak to her." Stephen blinked. "When?" "Before she leaves Dodge City, this afternoon." Pearl looked at the clock on the restaurant wall. "She is likely still at the Grand Hotel. Dodd will be in conference with his lawyer, which means she will be alone, which means she may be more willing to talk." "And you think she will simply tell you things?" Pearl picked up her satchel. "Women in difficult situations often respond to being treated as intelligent people rather than as problems to be managed. I plan to treat her as an intelligent person." She stood. "Are you coming?" He was on his feet before she finished asking. They walked to the Grand Hotel through the afternoon sun, and Stephen was aware of the way people on the street looked at them. A few openly, most with the sideways observation of a small frontier community that noticed everything and processed it loudly at dinner tables. He and Pearl walking together was not unusual. They had been seen together regularly over the past year, at town meetings and at the market, and at the occasional social occasion, where Pearl attended alone and Stephen attended alone, and they inevitably ended up in the same conversations. But there was something different about today, and he suspected that the difference was visible to anyone looking, because it was visible to him. They found Vivienne Holt in the hotel's small parlor, sitting alone at a writing desk with a cup of tea going cold beside her, and an expression on her face that confirmed Pearl's assessment. She was frightened. She was in her early 30s. Stephen guessed close to Pearl's age, though they were entirely different in type. Where Pearl was compact and dark and intensely focused, Vivienne was tall and fair and looked, at this moment, very young and very uncertain. She looked up when they came in and her face went through several things quickly. Pearl sat down across from her without being invited, placed the leather satchel on the floor and folded her hands on the writing desk. "My name is Pearl Merriweather," she said, "but you know that." Vivienne said nothing. "I'm not here to frighten you or threaten you," Pearl continued. "I am here because you are in a bad situation that is going to get significantly worse unless you make some choices very quickly, and I think you know that." A long pause, then, "What do you want?" "Information," Pearl said simply. "Who approached you? Was it Dodd or was it someone from the railroad?" Another pause, longer. Stephen stood near the door and was quiet, understanding that his job here was presence and not intervention. Vivienne Holt looked at Pearl for a long moment, and then something in her face made a decision. "A man named Gerard Plum," she said. "He works for the Missouri Pacific Land Office. He found me in Wichita 3 months ago. He told me Harold Merriweather had left a prior claim, that there was a deed, that I was a distant relation of Harold's mother and therefore a plausible heir. He said the deed would hold, that the widow didn't have the means to challenge it, and that if the property transferred to me, I would receive $500 and the railroad would buy me out immediately after. Her voice was steady, but she was gripping the edge of the writing desk. He did not tell me the deed was fabricated. Pearl's face showed nothing. Did you know Harold Merriweather? No, I never met him in my life. Plum told me I didn't need to, that the claim was in the documents, and the documents were what mattered. Vivienne looked at her hands. I needed the money. I lost my husband 2 years ago, and the situation has been very difficult. Plum offered $500, and it seemed, I know how it seems now. It seems like someone took advantage of a vulnerable woman, Pearl said, and her voice was not unkind. Vivienne looked up sharply. I am angry, Pearl said, clearly and honestly. I am very angry at this situation, but my anger is directed at the people who organized it, not at you. You were used. She opened the satchel. I need a written statement from you, describing everything you just told me, Plum's name, the Wichita meeting, the offer, everything. If you provide that statement, you have information that protects you. You cooperated with the investigation. The district attorney will likely deal with you very differently than with Dodd. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You came in here to help me. I came in here to get information, Pearl said. It happens to also help you. Those things are not mutually exclusive. She placed a clean sheet of paper and a pen on the desk. Will you write it? Vivienne Holt looked at Pearl Merriweather for another long moment, and then she picked up the pen. She wrote for 20 minutes, and Pearl read the statement twice, and then she folded it carefully and placed it in the satchel, and she stood and offered Vivienne her hand. I would suggest, Pearl said, that you go home to Wichita and stay away from Gerard Plum and Clarence Dodd. Yes, Vivienne said. She shook Pearl's hand, and then she looked at her with those young, uncertain eyes. I am sorry for all of it. I know, Pearl said. They walked out of the hotel into the late afternoon. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the Dodge City street in shades of amber and rust, and Pearl walked beside him with the leather satchel over her shoulder and an expression of focused determination that was already turning toward the next problem. Gerard Plum, Stephen said, Missouri Pacific Land Office. He will have a Wichita address, possibly a Kansas City office as well. She was already thinking ahead. Vivienne's statement, combined with my analysis of the forgery and the documentation of the rail line proposal, should be enough for the district attorney to pursue a fraud investigation. Dodd gets prosecuted. Plum, if Vivienne's account can be corroborated, gets implicated. She paused. The railroad itself is harder. Large companies have large legal resources. But a public fraud investigation with named railroad employees creates a different kind of problem for them. A reputation problem, a shareholder problem, that sometimes produces more results than a court case. Stephen looked at her sideways. You have thought about this a great deal. I have thought about almost nothing else for 72 hours. He stopped walking. She took 2 more steps and then stopped too and turned to look at him. Pearl, he said, stop for a moment. She looked at him with the patient, watchful expression she used when she was letting someone speak. You have been carrying this alone for 3 days, he said. You sat in that courthouse this morning and delivered testimony that it was extraordinary, Pearl. I want you to know that I mean that without qualification. What you did in there was extraordinary. And you have done it while managing your ranch and your hands and the injunction filing and the telegraph correspondence, and apparently conducting your own investigation into the railroad simultaneously. He stopped. I want you to know that I see that. I want you to know that what you have built out here, and what you defended today, is remarkable. She looked at him for a moment that stretched in a way that felt different from their usual comfortable silences. Thank you, she said quietly. I am not finished, he said. I also want to say, and I recognize this is not the moment, and you are exhausted, and there are several significant legal problems still to be resolved, but I want to say it because I have been not saying it for approximately 1 year, and I think that has gone on long enough. She was very still. "I would like to spend considerably more time in your company," he said, "if you would like that as well. Not as a neighbor, not as someone who brings timber over when you need repairs. As someone who—" He stopped and tried again. "I admire you, Pearl. I admire your mind and your courage and the way you approach a problem and the way you approach everything. And I have thought about you considerably more than is consistent with simple neighborly regard." The street was busy around them, cattle and horses and commerce moving in every direction, and they stood in it like two still points. Pearl looked at him, the careful, measuring look that was always the first stage of how she approached anything important. He held it without flinching, because Stephen Wells did not flinch from things that mattered to him. "You are right that this is not the moment," she said finally. "I know. I have a fraud investigation to complete and a ranch to manage, and I have not slept properly in 3 days. I know all of that. And I do not make impulsive decisions. I know that too. I would not expect you to." She looked at him for another moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was something in the neighborhood of one. "However," she said carefully, "I do not object to the general direction of what you have said." It was, he recognized, the most cautious possible form of encouragement, and it was also, from Pearl Merriweather, the equivalent of a declaration. He smiled at her. He rarely smiled. It was not something that came easily to his face, and when he did it changed the whole character of his expression, and Pearl looked at it for just a moment before she looked away, which he stored away with some satisfaction. "All right then," he said. "Shall we go find the district attorney?" They spent the next 3 days in Dodge City working. Pearl met with District Attorney Harlow Reese, a careful, bureaucratic man who was initially skeptical of the railroad connection, but who became progressively less skeptical, as Pearl laid out the sequence of evidence with the methodical clarity that she brought to everything. Stephen provided corroborating context about the railroad's acquisition pressure across the county. He had received similar approaches himself, though his land was not in the direct path, and his established reputation in Ford County carried weight with Reese in a way that was frustrating but useful. Vivian Holt's statement was filed. Clarence Dodd, upon learning of it, immediately entered negotiations with the district attorney that produced a detailed account of Gerard Plum's involvement in exchange for reduced charges. The Missouri Pacific Land Office, when confronted with documented evidence of fraud conducted by one of its senior acquisition agents, made the political calculation that a rapid settlement was preferable to a public investigation, and within 10 days had paid a substantial sum to both the Ford County Court and directly to Pearl as restitution for the costs she had incurred in her defense. Stephen and Pearl worked side by side through those 10 days, and in the spaces between meetings and filings and telegraph messages they talked. Really talked, in the way that people do when the urgency of a shared problem creates the specific intimacy of two minds working toward the same thing. He told her about Texas and the cattle drives and why he had decided to stop moving. She told him about Ohio and Professor Hartwell and the 3 years she had spent learning a skill she had never imagined she would need on a Kansas cattle ranch. "Did you always know you would come west?" he asked her one evening on the front porch of the house where she had taken a room at the hotel. "No," she said honestly. "I knew I wanted to do something that mattered, something that required all of me. I thought for a while that the document work would be that thing. But there is something about land, about working land, managing it, watching something grow from effort that the document examination never gave me." She paused. "Harold offered me a life here. It was practical. I chose it for practical reasons, but I stayed because I found I loved it." He nodded. He understood this completely. "And the skill came with you," he said. "The skill came with me," she agreed. "I brought every book I had. I brought the lens. I thought perhaps I would never use it." A small, wry note in her voice. "I was wrong about that." He looked at her in the evening light, and the feelings that had been reorganizing themselves in his chest since the courthouse had settled into something clear and certain and calm, the way things settle after a storm. On the 11th day, The injunction was formalized into a full court ruling in Pearl's favor. The Merriweather deed was declared uncontested. Clarence Dodd received a fine and a strong advisement from the district attorney to conduct his future business affairs more carefully. Gerard Plum was recalled by the Missouri Pacific and quietly removed from his position, not prosecuted, which Pearl found unsatisfying but realistic, and which she noted in writing to the company with the kind of precise, measured language that communicated clearly that she would be watching. On the morning of the 12th day, Pearl rode back to the Merriweather ranch. Stephen rode alongside her. They rode for a while without talking, which was comfortable, and then they rode for a while talking about nothing consequential: the condition of the summer grass, the early signs of what the cattle market might do in September, a story Cobb Danner had told Stephen about a runaway mule that had somehow ended up inside the Dodge City Telegraph office. Pearl laughed at the mule story in the unguarded way she laughed at things when she was relaxed, with her whole face in it, and Stephen looked at her and felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the Kansas summer. They reached the Merriweather property as the afternoon was settling toward evening, and the ranch came into view with its fence lines and its house and its two big pastures where the herd was grazing, and Pearl stopped her horse at the gate and sat looking at it for a moment. "Mine," she said quietly. It was not a triumphant word. It was something older and deeper than triumph. It was the word of a person looking at something they had worked for and fought for and refused to let go of, and confirming to themselves that it is still there. Stephen sat beside her and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. After a moment she urged her horse forward through the gate, and he rode beside her up to the house, and Cobb Danner came out of the barn grinning, and Eli Danner came out behind him, and there was a brief, enthusiastic account of the outcome shared between all of them that ended with Cobb suggesting a celebratory meal that Eli immediately agreed to cook, and Pearl accepted with the warmth of someone who has good people around her and knows it. That evening Stephen sat at the Merriweather kitchen table and ate the best beef stew he had tasted in a year, and afterward the Danner brothers made themselves scarce in the diplomatic way of men who are perceptive about the moods of the people they work for, and Stephen and Pearl sat on the porch in the cooling evening and watched the Kansas dark come down over the grass. "I keep thinking about Vivienne," Pearl said after a while. "What about her? She made a desperate choice because she was in a desperate situation, and the choice was wrong and it caused real harm to me, to Dodd, in some measure to herself. But I understand how you get there." She paused. "There is very little margin out here, for anyone but especially for women alone. The margin is so small that one bad decision can take everything." He was quiet, knowing this was true. "I almost lost this ranch," she said simply. "Not almost in the dramatic sense. The deed was a forgery and I had the evidence to prove it. But if I had not had that training, if Professor Hartwell had not taught me about oxidation rates and signature analysis, I would have had nothing but my own word that Harold never mentioned Vivienne Holt, and my word against a forged legal document is—" She stopped. "It would have been very bad," he said. "Yes." She looked out at the dark. "The world is arranged in a way that makes it very easy to take things from women. The law helps if you know how to use it and if you can afford to use it. But knowing how to use it requires knowledge that most people do not have access to, and the cost of accessing it is high enough that many cannot." She paused. "I know I am fortunate. I know that the specific combination of my husband's respect for my abilities and my own education and the money in the bank account and the neighbors who are good people, I know that is not the common experience." Stephen looked at her profile against the dark. "What do you do with that knowledge?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "I have been thinking about it. There is a women's civic association in Dodge City that Mrs. Ida Forsythe is involved with. She has mentioned several times that they would benefit from someone with legal document knowledge who could provide some kind of, I am not sure exactly what form it would take. Education, perhaps, Consultation. She paused. I have been considering whether I could do something useful in that direction while still running the ranch. He looked at her for a long time. I think, he said, that you could do most things you decided to do. She turned and looked at him, and the evening light was soft and the distance between them on the porch was not very large, and she said, "You really mean that?" "I do," he said. "I have never meant anything more directly." She looked at him with that careful, measuring look, and then she said, with the precision that was characteristic of her but with something underneath it that he had not heard before, "Stephen, what exactly is it that you want from me? From whatever this is?" He answered without hesitation, because he had been thinking about it clearly for 12 days and had arrived at an answer that felt entirely honest. "I want to know you better," he said. "I want to know all the parts of you that I have not yet learned about, which I suspect are considerable. I want to ride to town with you and eat meals with you and argue with you when we disagree about things, which I imagine will happen with some regularity given that we are both fairly certain people." He paused. "I want to be the person you tell things to. And I would like, eventually, if you decided you wanted it too, to build something with you. Not because you need someone to help you build it. Because I would like to be part of what you build." The night was very quiet around them. Pearl said, "You understand that I will not change who I am. I would not want you to. I make my own decisions. About the ranch, about my money, about what I do with my time." "Yes," he said, "obviously. And you will not be offended when I am better at something than you are." He thought about the courthouse. He thought about the ink oxidation rates and the signature ratios and the precise, devastating case she had built in 3 sleepless days. He thought about the moment he had understood that she had not needed rescuing and what it had done to him. "Pearl," he said, "watching you be better at things than me is one of the specific pleasures I am most looking forward to." She looked at him for a long moment. And then she laughed, that unguarded, whole-face laugh, and when it subsided she was looking at him with something warm and open in her expression that he had not seen before, and it was better than anything that had come before it. "All right," she said. "Then I suppose we are doing this." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that in the Kansas dark while the summer night settled around the ranch, and the cattle moved peacefully in the pasture, and the stars came out over the grass in their thousands. In the weeks that followed, Stephen Wells and Pearl Merriweather conducted their courtship in the particular style of 2 capable, self-possessed adults who have arrived at the conclusion that they want each other's company through careful reasoning rather than sudden impulse, and who are in no particular hurry because certainty does not require speed. He came for dinner twice a week. She came to look at his herd rotation strategy and told him, with characteristic directness, that he was underusing the northeastern pasture, and she was right, and he restructured his approach accordingly, and the cattle showed it by September. They attended the Ford County Cattlemen's Association meeting together in August, and Pearl presented an analysis of projected market prices for the fall that so thoroughly impressed the assembled ranchers that she was immediately invited to join the association's advisory committee, a position previously held exclusively by men. Stephen sat in the back of that meeting room and watched her speak, and felt the pride in his chest so clearly that it was almost embarrassing. She was invited to dinner at his ranch in late August, and she came and saw that it was well run and careful, and that his house was clean, and that he kept his books accurately, and that his 2 ranch hands, a man named Cole and a man named Bernard, were treated fairly and spoke well of their employer. She noted all of this without comment, but he could tell from the quality of her attention that she was noting it, and this seemed appropriate to him. She was a thorough person. Thoroughness was her gift and her nature. He would not want her to be anything else. In September, during the Ford County Fair that brought half the territory into Dodge City for a weekend of commerce and competition, they walked through the fairground in the late afternoon, and she won the agricultural planning competition, which she had entered on something of a whim, producing an annotated land management proposal for a fictional 2,000-acre ranch that left the three judges visibly struggling to find critique. The prize was a silver ribbon, and the moderator's acknowledgement that her proposal would be submitted to the Kansas Agricultural Review for publication consideration. Stephen bought her a piece of apple pie from a stall near the competition tent, and she ate it standing up with total unself-consciousness, and the ribbon was tucked into her jacket pocket, and she was flushed with the particular pleasure of having performed well at something that mattered to her. And he kissed her for the first time right there beside the apple pie stall with the noise of the fair all around them. She looked at him after, with wide eyes and a slightly startled expression that was unusual on her face. "That was somewhat impulsive of you," she said. "Yes," he agreed, not apologizing for it. The startled expression resolved into something considerably warmer. "Well," she said. "All right." Autumn came to the Kansas grassland in the particular vivid way it did there, the light going amber, the grass turning gold, the air sharpening into something that made the whole world seem more precise and defined. Pearl turned 28 in October, and Stephen brought her a complete set of scientific papers by a German chemist named Karl Hofmann, who had published extensively on the chemistry of iron gall ink, which he had ordered through a bookshop in Kansas City, and which had taken 3 weeks to arrive. She looked at the papers and then at him and said nothing for a moment. "You ordered these for me specifically," she said. "Yes." "You wrote to the Kansas City bookshop and described the subject matter and asked them to source relevant publications." "It took 2 letters. The bookshop owner was very helpful." Pearl looked at the papers again, and he watched something move across her face that was slower and deeper than the flash of pleasure she got from winning competitions or resolving problems. It was the expression of someone who has been seen specifically, accurately, all the way through. "Thank you," she said, and it came out quieter than she intended. He did not make a production of it. He simply nodded because the point had been made. In November, after the cattle were sold at market for a return that exceeded Pearl's September projections by a satisfying margin and Stephen's own herd, did well enough to fund the improvements he had been planning on his north pasture, he asked Pearl if she would marry him. He did not do it grandly or dramatically. He did it on a Wednesday evening on her porch after dinner, having thought about it carefully, and decided that the only approach consistent with who she was and who he was a direct and honest one. "Pearl," he said, "I would like to marry you. I would like to build a life here with you, side by side on this land, as partners in the full sense of the word. I want your name to be your own business, and I want your land to be your own, and I want us to work together and live together and grow old together on this grass. I think we would be very good at it." She looked at him for the long, careful moment that preceded all her significant decisions. "I think so too," she said. They married in December of 1880, in a small ceremony at the Dodge City Church with the Danner brothers as witnesses and Mrs. Ida Forsythe and her husband as the other guests, and Pearl wore a deep blue dress she had made herself over 3 weeks of careful work and looked, in Stephen's estimation, like someone who had decided to be happy, and was doing it with the same thorough competence she brought to everything else. The minister was a young man named Reverend Aldrich who was good at his work and kept the ceremony brisk and honest. And when Stephen said his vows, he said them looking directly at Pearl, because he had always been someone who looked directly at things that mattered. And she said hers back to him with the clear, steady voice of a woman who has thought carefully about every word she is saying and means all of them. Afterward there was a dinner at the Drovers' Rest, and the Forsythes were good company, and the Danner brothers were very cheerful, and the food was better than usual. And by evening they were home at the Merriweather Ranch, which they had decided to keep as their primary residence, since Pearl's house was larger and better situated, and the Kansas winter stars were out in their millions over the dark land. Spring came early to the Kansas territory in 1881, and with it came several things at once. The Missouri Pacific Railroad, having quietly resolved its land acquisition scandal, and installed new management in its land office, returned to the question of the southeast right-of-way through the Merriweather property with an entirely different approach. They sent a representative named Mr. Thomas Gallagher, who was polite and straightforward, and who sat down with Pearl and Stephen together and offered a right-of-way lease rather than a land purchase, with terms that Pearl negotiated over 2 meetings into something fair and reasonable that preserved the ranch's integrity and produced an annual income that substantially improved their financial position. Stephen watched Pearl negotiate with Gallagher with the same focused, relentless precision she brought to everything, and when the railroad man left with the signed agreement, he looked slightly dazed in the way of someone who expected a simple transaction and received a graduate seminar in property law. Stephen handed Pearl a cup of coffee, and she accepted it with the satisfied expression of a person who has closed a problem completely. "Well," she said, "that is that." "Beautifully done," he said. "It was fair to both parties," she said, and he understood that this was, to her, the measure of a good outcome. Not victory over the other side, but an arrangement that was genuinely equitable. It was one of the things he loved about her, the way she calibrated her intelligence not toward domination, but toward correctness. Also in the spring of 1881, Pearl began working with Mrs. Forsythe's Women's Civic Association. It started as a monthly session at the Dodge City Reading Room, where Pearl offered practical education in reading and evaluating legal documents, deeds, contracts, promissory notes, the kind of paperwork that shaped lives in ways most people did not fully understand until the consequences came for them. The sessions grew from 5 attendees in January to 22 by March, drawing women from across Ford County who came not always because they faced immediate legal problems, but because they recognized that knowledge was a form of protection, and Pearl Merriweather had both demonstrated and embodied that truth in a way the whole county had witnessed. The sessions became something larger than any of them had intended. Pearl prepared written materials that could be shared with women who could not come to Dodge City. Mrs. Forsythe connected them with a women's education organization in Topeka that was interested in the materials. By summer, Pearl was corresponding regularly with women in 3 Kansas counties who were using her document literacy guides to understand and challenge unfair contracts and agreements. Stephen read every letter she drafted when she wanted to share them, and he sometimes offered a word or phrase for clarity, and she sometimes took the suggestion and sometimes said, with characteristic honesty, that she thought her version was better, and she was usually right. He did not mind any of this. He found it, consistently and entirely, to be one of the great pleasures of his life. In the fall of 1881, Pearl told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen after breakfast with her usual directness, and Stephen sat very still for a moment and then stood up and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she let him, which she did not always do when she was in working mode and moving quickly through the day. "Are you well?" he said. "Perfectly," she said. "I saw Dr. Carmichael in town last week. Everything is normal." She paused. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything." He pulled back enough to look at her face. "You have known for a week." "I wanted to be certain," she repeated unapologetically. He laughed, which surprised them both, a deep, genuine laugh of the kind he did not produce often. "Of course you did," he said. Their son was born in April of 1882, with the spring coming through the window of the Merriweather ranch house and the prairie grass turning green outside, and he was healthy and strong and screamed with impressive volume, which Dr. Carmichael said was an excellent sign. They named him Harold Thomas Wells, Harold for Pearl's first husband, because Pearl said it was right to honor the man who had brought her to the land she loved, and Thomas for Stephen's father, who had been a quiet and decent man in Texas a long time ago. Stephen held the baby in the first hour of his life and felt something shift in him so fundamentally that it was like the ground of himself had moved, and he looked down at this small person and then at Pearl, who was exhausted and bright-eyed and watching him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something softer and more open than her usual careful composure. "He looks like he is already thinking about something," Pearl said. Stephen looked at the baby. He did actually have a furrowed, contemplative expression. "Gets that from his mother," Stephen said. Pearl smiled at him, slowly and completely, and he thought it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Harold Thomas Wells was an agreeable baby and a determined toddler and a child who asked relentless questions about everything he encountered, which his mother answered with thorough accuracy, and his father answered with the patient good humor of a man who was deeply happy with his life. He followed Pearl around the ranch from the time he could walk, and he followed Stephen to the pastures and the barn, and he absorbed everything with the particular focus of a child who has been treated from the beginning as someone whose intelligence is worth engaging. The ranch grew. The railroad lease income made improvements possible that had been out of reach before: a new barn, better fencing on the north pasture, expansion of the herd by 40 head. Stephen bought an additional 200 acres on his eastern boundary that connected his spread to the Merriweather land in a way that made both properties more manageable, and they began to think of the combined land as a single operation even though they kept the deeds separate, which Pearl insisted on for reasons she articulated clearly as both practical and principled. "Two separate deeds, two separate legal records," she said. "If anything ever happens to either of us, the other does not have to spend a year in court proving what belongs to whom." He agreed completely. In the summer of 1883, a young woman came to the monthly document literacy session in Dodge City with a promissory note that her landlord claimed entitled him to the entirety of her household's accumulated savings upon a minor missed payment. Pearl read the note and identified in it a clause that was both fraudulent in its intent and unenforceable under Kansas contract law, and she helped the woman draft a response that caused the landlord's subsequent behavior to reverse itself with impressive speed. The young woman's name was Clara Hatch, daughter of Thomas Hatch, who had been one of Pearl's document witnesses during the Dodd case, and she became, over the following year, Pearl's primary assistant in the education sessions. She was 20 years old and quick and earnest and good with people in a way that complemented Pearl's precision, and Pearl taught her everything about document analysis with the same thorough commitment that Professor Hartwell had once shown to her. "You are training her," Stephen said one evening when Pearl described the work. "I am sharing knowledge," Pearl said. "You are making sure that when you are eventually too busy or too old to run these sessions yourself, the work continues," he said. She looked at him. Then she acknowledged it with a small nod. "Yes, that is also what I am doing." He loved her very much. In the autumn of 1883, Pearl told him she was expecting again. This time she told him after 4 days rather than a week, which he recognized as a gesture toward him even if she would not have described it in those terms. Their daughter was born in May of 1884, small and dark-haired and immediately, thoroughly opinionated about everything, and they named her Eleanor, after Pearl's mother who had died when Pearl was 10 years old. Eleanor was a person from the beginning, which was the only way Stephen could describe it. She arrived in the world with the clear sense of herself that some children simply have, and she made her preferences known with a directness that made her parents exchange looks of recognition. She was 8 months old when she rejected, with emphatic and systematic effort, a specific rattle that her brother Harold loved, and Pearl watched this and said, quite seriously, "She knows what she wants." "She is 8 months old," Stephen said. "Precisely," said Pearl. "Good instincts young." Harold adored his sister with a fierceness that did not require development. It was simply there from the first day, a settled fact. He brought her things. He told her about the horses and the cattle and the stars with the assumption that she would be interested, which she was. She watched him with wide, dark eyes that looked exactly like Pearl's and that conveyed the same quality of focused attention. The Merriweather Wells Ranch, as it had come to be known in the county, which Pearl had accepted as a reasonable informal designation while maintaining the separate legal structures, was by 1885 one of the more successful operations in Ford County, not because they had the most land or the largest herd, but because everything on it was managed with a level of care and intelligence that produced consistent results. The cattle were healthy. The land rotation worked. The books were accurate. The people who worked there were treated well, which meant they stayed and did their work with the investment of people who had a stake in the outcome. Cobb Danner had married a woman named Ruth who had moved from a farm east of Dodge, and Eli Danner had not married but had developed an expertise in horse management that made him quietly famous in the county, and Cole and Bernard continued at Stephen's side of the operation with the loyalty of men who had been treated decently for years and intended to continue in that employment. The world around them changed and continued to change, as it always did. The cattle drives that had defined Dodge City in its early years were diminishing as the railroad moved further west and the ranges gave way to settlement. The open range era was ending, and fenced property lines and systematic ranching were replacing the old ways of driving cattle hundreds of miles. Some ranchers struggled with this transition. Pearl and Stephen had anticipated it. Pearl had noted the trend in her correspondence with the Kansas Agricultural Review and written about it clearly 3 years before it became apparent to most of the county, and they had positioned the operation accordingly. They attended the Ford County Cattlemen's Association meetings together always, and Pearl had long since become one of its most respected advisory voices, which had required exactly the amount of work and persistence that one would expect given that she was a woman doing this in 1880s Kansas. There were men who remained resistant to her presence at those meetings, and they remained resistant in decreasing numbers as the years passed and her track record accumulated, and Pearl treated this not as a personal battle but as a logical process. Present the evidence clearly, demonstrate the results consistently, and allow people to come to rational conclusions at their own pace. Stephen occasionally wanted to be less patient with the process than Pearl was. "That man is a fool," he said one evening, after a meeting at which one of the older ranchers had talked over Pearl twice during her presentation. "He is behind the times," Pearl said, "which is not precisely the same thing, though it produces similar results in the short term. He talked over you." "Yes." And the 6 ranchers seated around him watched it happen and noticed it, and 2 of them spoke to me afterward with specific apologies for the interruptions. The social accounting happens at its own pace. She paused. "I have been making this argument for 5 years. 5 more years and it will be largely unnecessary." He looked at her with the particular admiration that she still consistently produced in him, even after 5 years of marriage. "You are a remarkable woman," he said. "I am a thorough one," she said. "It amounts to the same thing in the long run." He kissed her, and she led him with the particular warmth she reserved for the private moments of their life together, the times when the careful composure she brought to everything else came down, and she was simply herself with him, completely and without reservation. In the late summer of 1885, something happened that none of them had anticipated. A letter arrived from Denver, addressed to Pearl Merriweather Wells, from a woman named Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, the widow of Professor Eli Hartwell, who had died the previous winter. The letter informed Pearl that Professor Hartwell, in his will, had left his entire personal library of forensic document examination texts, 47 volumes and approximately 200 research papers, to Pearl, whom he had described as his finest student and the one he believed had done the most to apply the discipline to purposes that mattered. Pearl read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then she set it down and was quiet for a long time. Stephen waited. "He remembered me," she said finally. "Of course he did," Stephen said. "It has been 12 years since I was his student." Her voice was careful in the way it got when she was moved by something she was not sure she wanted to show. "He kept track of what I did out here. Mrs. Hartwell says his letters mention the Dodd case. She looked at the letter again. He was proud. Stephen reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand under his and held it and did not say anything more and did not need to. The library arrived in 3 crates in October, and Pearl spent 3 joyful weekends cataloging and shelving every volume in the room that had become, over the years, her study and workspace. Harold, at 4 years old, was allowed to help organize the lower shelves and did so with the focused seriousness of a child who understood this was important work. Eleanor, at 1.5 years, mostly contributed by pulling things off the shelves as fast as Harold put them on, which created a dynamic that Stephen watched from the doorway with great enjoyment. Clara Hatch came out from Dodge City to see the library and stayed for dinner, and she and Pearl spent 2 hours after dinner discussing which of the volumes would be most useful for the document literacy sessions, and which might be adapted for the written guides that were now being used in 8 Kansas counties. Stephen listened to this conversation from his chair by the fire and thought about how 5 years ago a forged deed had been laid on a judge's desk, and it had led here, to this room, to this family, to this work, to this woman who sat across from a young student she was training to carry forward the things she had built. The dark past had led to this present. The betrayal had become, in the end, the catalyst for everything they had. He said this to Pearl that night, after Clara had ridden back to town and the children were asleep and they were sitting on the porch in the October cool. "The deed," he said, "the whole thing with Dodd. It is strange to think of it as something that led to good things." Pearl considered this. It did not lead to good things. The good things already existed, the work I was doing on the document literacy, the thinking I had been doing about the railroad and the land rights, even the way I felt about you, which I had been avoiding looking at directly for several months. She paused. What the deed did was create a forced choice. Either face everything all at once and use every resource available or lose it all. In a forced choice, you find out what you actually have. He was quiet. "What I found out," she said, "was that I had more than I thought." She turned to look at him. "The skill, the evidence, the analysis, but also you in the back of the gallery, the Danner brothers ready to support whatever needed supporting, Mrs. Forsyth at the telegraph office relaying messages, Clara Hatch's father authenticating documents. None of that was visible to me until the crisis made it visible. And now," he said. "Now I know it is there," she said simply. "All of it." He looked at her in the dark, at the woman he had watched stand in a courthouse and dismantle a conspiracy with the precision of a scientist and the courage of, he had never found the right word for what Pearl Merriweather was, the specific combination of things that she brought to the world. He had stopped looking for the word and simply recognized the fact of her, which was its own kind of understanding. "Pearl," he said, "I love you." She looked at him with those dark eyes that had always looked like they were measuring something, and what they were measuring, he knew now, was never about finding him lacking. It was about finding the true shape of things, the actual dimensions of what was in front of her, the real rather than the approximate. "I love you," she said back, in the same steady, direct way she said everything that she meant. They sat together in the Kansas night, which was enormous and clear and starred, and the land around them was theirs, hers and his and their children's. And the grass moved in the wind in the old, continuous way it had always moved, indifferent to the human dramas played out on its surface, patient and enduring in the way that the land of the plains is patient and enduring. The years that followed were full. Not in the frantic sense. They were not people given to frantic motion, but full in the way of lives that have direction and purpose and people in them. Harold grew into a tall, observant boy who loved mathematics and had a talent for the practical mechanics of the ranch. He could diagnose a fence problem by sight at 10 years old in a way that made Cobb Danner shake his head admiringly. Eleanor grew into exactly the person she had announced herself to be in infancy, certain, curious, and entirely unwilling to accept that any door was closed to her by virtue of her being who she was. She started accompanying Pearl to the document literacy sessions at 8 years old, not to participate, but to observe, with the same quality of attention that Pearl brought to everything, inherited completely. Pearl's written guides for document literacy became, by 1888, an official resource of the Kansas Women's Education League. She corresponded regularly with similar efforts in Colorado, Missouri, and Nebraska. Her name was known, in certain circles, as something worth knowing. Stephen built the North Pasture expansion that he had been planning for years, and it performed exactly as he had modeled it. Pearl's influence on his approach to systematic analysis had long since permeated every part of how he ran the land. They were, by that point, so thoroughly integrated in their thinking and their practice that people who met them separately noticed something was missing, and people who met them together could see immediately what it was. In 1889, when Harold was 7 and Alina was 5, Pearl told Stephen one morning at breakfast that she thought they might want to consider a third. He looked up from his coffee. "I have been thinking about it for several months," she said, with the calm directness that characterized all her significant communications. "We have the space and the capacity, and I believe we have more to give." She looked at him over the table. "What do you think?" What he thought was that he had married the most remarkable person he had ever encountered, and that every day he was correct about this, and that whatever she thought was probably the right conclusion. "Yes," he said, "I think so too." Their second son arrived in the summer of 1890, on a hot July morning when the Kansas sun was flat and bright over the grass, and the whole ranch seemed to hold its breath. And he came into the world with the same healthy lungs as his older brother, and a look of general interested inquiry that made Pearl laugh the moment she saw it. They named him Eli, for Professor Eli Hartwell, and also, though neither of them said this aloud, because the name felt right, felt like continuity, like the thread of something important being carried forward into the next generation. Harold held his new brother with the careful gravity of a 7-year-old who understands the weight of what he is holding. Alina inspected him with scientific interest and announced that he had ears like their father, which was accurate. Stephen held him at the end of the long day when the house had quieted, in the chair by the window where the evening light came through, and looked at this new person who was already, in his specific way, himself, and felt the fullness of everything around him. The land and the house and the family and the woman sleeping in the next room, as a thing so complete it was almost too large to hold. He thought about a courthouse in 1880, and a man in a silver brocade waistcoat, and a forged deed laid on a judge's desk, and a woman with a leather satchel who had said 3 words that changed everything. He thought about standing against that wall and watching her, and the cold dread he had felt before he understood what she was doing, and the shock that had moved through him when he did understand the specific, reorganizing shock of encountering someone's full capability and being permanently changed by it. He thought about the porch conversation and the apple pie and the December wedding and the Hartwell Library in its 3 crates and the thousands of small, ordinary moments that made up a life and that were, he now understood completely, the actual substance of everything that mattered. He sat in the chair by the window with his son in his arms while the Kansas summer dark settled over the land, and he was entirely and thoroughly content, in the deep and lasting way that has nothing to do with the absence of difficulty and everything to do with the presence of what is true and good and yours. In the morning Pearl would be at her desk by the time he came down, with coffee already made and papers already organized, working on something correspondence for the Education League, or ranch accounts, or possibly a response to the Nebraska Women's Association that had written last week about adapting her document literacy materials for their region. She would look up when he came in and say something dry and precise that would make him smile, and the children would come down in stages, Harold focused and serious, Alina with immediate opinions about the day, Little Eli round and cheerful and interested in everything. He would pour his coffee and sit across from her at the kitchen table, and they would talk about the day in the practical, specific way of two people who know each other entirely and work together without competition and trust each other with everything. And outside, the Kansas land would be doing what it always did, patient and enormous and enduring, and the grass would move in the wind, and the cattle would graze in the good pastures that they had built together, and the fence lines they had repaired and replaced and extended over 10 years of shared work would hold. The deed had been a forgery. The cowboy had read it twice and never blinked. And the widow had read it once and known exactly what she was looking at, because she was the kind of person who had always known that paper remembers everything, and that the truth, when you have the knowledge and the courage to find it, does not stay hidden. It had led here, to this, to all of it, and all of it, every single part, was exactly right.